Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley broadcasting, as usual, from Washington, D.C. And for those who are keeping schedule, it's Friday, March 2nd in the afternoon here in Washington, D.C. Now, the U.S. State Department, the Obama regime, the British, NATO, so forth, have big problems. In particular, the State Department has a series of elections that it hates. Normally, the State Department pretends to be the great center of democratic values, the world guardian and watchdog of human rights and all the rest of this nonsense. However, right now they've got 3 elections that are staring them in the face and a 4th election, which is coming in the springtime, in April to May, which they're also probably not going to like. And this is a series of votes. Now, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Russia, and we're probably talking about Egypt a little bit further down the road. Now, let's take a look at this in some detail. You remember last week we had the conference of the enemies of Syria in Tunisia, and this conference was remarkable mainly because it was a fiasco. It couldn't agree on anything. The attendance was low. Russia, China didn't come. The Saudis walked out. There was a huge demonstration outside of this gathering of imperialist vultures. So not looking too good. Hillary Clinton, at the end of it, ranted and raved. The conference was such a failure that she had to cover her retreat with a cloud of threats and invective. And she said the Russians and the Chinese are despicable. So one of the big events of the week are the Russians and the Chinese naturally refuting the charge that they're despicable. That caused quite a stir. And good that she's that stupid. Good that her diplomacy is so undiplomatic, primitive, stupid, ham-handed, whatever. That will tend to solidify the Russia-Chinese opposition to the looming war on Syria, Iran, and beyond. Then last Sunday we had a vote in Syria, which was the vote for the new constitution. And whatever one may think of this, it enjoys an absolute majority of support, not just a plurality, but an absolute majority. The turnout was approximately 57% under very difficult conditions, right? Civil war in 3 or 4 cities, although not beyond that. And then about 90% support for the Constitution. So that gets you over 51%, 51.3 or thereabouts, with those rough figures. In any case, it is an absolute majority. Naturally, the State Department doesn't like these votes. The State Department supports elections when the State Department side candidate or side of the question wins, but otherwise not. What hypocrisy, what double standards. So here we have a reformed constitution that ends the monopoly of power of the Ba'ath Party after all these decades, and the State Department says, no, that's not good enough. We demand civil war, because they, of course, encourage their various puppets, the Syrian National Council, so-called, in quotes, and the Free Syrian Army, in reality a group of al-Qaeda death squads. They are encouraged not to take part in any negotiations with the Assad regime. So here's a national election carried out under arduous circumstances, and the State Department says no. In the course of the week since then, we've had the Gulf states, the reactionary feudal monarchies, are now the teachers of democracy to the region. Right? As President Ahmadinejad said in his speech on the 33rd anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, how surprising that countries that have never had an election, never had a national election for any serious post, are now absolutely fixated on democratic rights. And that's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, I guess, and Kuwait. Don't forget them. Don't forget the Sabah family. So Sabahs, Khalifas, Thanis are all now Democrats, all in the very dangerous tradition of Philippe Égalité. So the Saudis and the rest of them now say that they just can't restrain themselves. They're going to be funding arms, sending arms into Syria. Some people have pointed out the behavior of Saudi Arabia in regard to Syria is exactly the same thing they did during the Afghan war, the first one against the Soviets, by supporting this organization that was actually founded by the U.S., but with the Saudis providing the money. That was, of course, the infamous Al-Qaeda, and what a coincidence, it's Al-Qaeda that the descendants of that, and in some cases the same people, who Al-Qaeda is now the leading edge of the Syrian effort in the Saudi effort inside Syria. And even Hillary Clinton has had to agree or to express her acute discomfort that is the case. Now, let's just look before we go on to the other elections, Iran, Russia, possibly Egypt, at least these NGO characters being shipped out, the subversive workers or the destabilization workers. The big news of the last 24 hours is that the Syrian army has completed the liberation of Bab Amr from the death squads, the NATO Al-Qaeda death squads. The forces of Colonel Assad and military governor Belhaj from Tripoli, Libya, have been driven out of Bab Amr. And again, whenever you hear these statistics, 7,000 dead, you have to ask, how many of those are Syrian army and Syrian police personnel that have been killed by these death squads, in many cases starting off as snipers shooting from the rooftops. So the Syrian army has now successfully quelled the armed rebellion in Bab Amr. This was not a democracy protest. This was war. The remaining strongholds, if we can call them that, the remaining strong points or stronger points of the death squads include Idlib. This is in the north on the Turkish border. Hama, that's a bit north of Homs. This is also near the Lebanese border. And Dara, which is near the Jordanian border. Notice that they're all eccentric. In other words, they're all near the edge. They're peripheral because the rebellion is stoked from the outside. So the question now is, what happens to Idlib, Hama, and Dara? Maybe we hope that the death squad participants there will see the handwriting on the wall and retreat, go back to their NATO paid-for hotels, right? Go back to those nice Turkish hotels and take it easy for the rest of the year with their mercenary money. The imperialist media are beside themselves today with consternation over the fall, the liberation of Homs, and they've got to focus, therefore, to cover their tracks on the humanitarian cases of the 2 journalists who were killed and 2 others, I believe, that had been wounded. Now, this is always portrayed as if the Syrian government was somehow preventing these people from being put into the hospital or gotten out of the country, gotten to Lebanon, whatever it is. Let's listen to Thierry Maison on the scene there in Syria, that these journalists were human shields held hostage until today by the Free Syrian Army, by the Al-Qaeda death squad people. We'll have a bit more about that in a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., looking at the predicament of the State Department and the U.S. regime, Obama, Panetta, Hillary, Rice, and company, elections that they don't like, elections that have mass support, that have been carried out, and are going to lead to results that they find unacceptable, and therefore the recourse to color revolutions, CIA people power coups, destabilization, subversion, and terrorism, and ultimately war. That's Syria, Iran, Russia, and we're looking also at Egypt, where the card of subversion has certainly been played with these NGO types, right? The Project Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute types. But just focusing on Syria for the moment, we are waiting to see what happens with Idlib, Hama, and Dara. How long can the death squads hold out in those places before they are driven out of there too, which will effectively bring the acute phase of the Syrian infiltration of death squads, I guess, to an end, at least in a preliminary sense. Let's see if the imperialists can swallow that, because that's going to be a huge humiliation for them. The story of the journalists was, remember last Friday we had actually had it on Thursday of last week, from a Syrian source, a Russian source in Syria more accurately, that there was going to be an attempt to accredit the story of 17 Syrian children killed by the evil Assad forces, and therefore stampede the Tunis conference a week ago Friday towards some kind of overt military adventure that didn't get off the ground, although you could see that there were attempts made in that direction. In particular, on about midnight Friday to Saturday, I'd like to thank a Dutch source for calling that to my attention. There was an attempt to put out a story that was very, very similar in its main outlines to the one that I had, that I and others had been warning against. So that's what happened to Marie Colvin and to the French photographer. They were apparently taking part in that, and we don't know the details of what happened to them. But now we have the French woman journalist Bouvier, I think her name is, and perhaps another one. The whole story this week was that they were being prevented from leaving. No, not by the Syrian army, but by the death squads themselves, by the self-styled Free Syrian Army. They were being held as human shields and as hostages, and virtually nobody in the Western media had the guts to report that one. So hats off to Thierry Meyssan, the Voltaire Network. They were the ones who, he was the one who actually put this story out, and I think it has gotten around the world to some extent what was actually happening. And that may be the key to why these people have gotten away with their lives. Not that their friends were hewing the NATO line, that wouldn't get you out, but the reality that the death squads were holding them, that I think may have convinced the NATO commanders to say, all right, we'll cut our losses on this one. The other story is how many French agents, how many French military officers in civilian clothes have been captured by the Syrians in and around Homs. Originally, it's about a dozen. Now it seems to be up to 18, so we can say almost 20 French agents, military officers, spooks, right? Presumably the DGSE. There's a direct connection, I believe, that the former mistress of the head of the former mistress of the former head of the DGSE is now one of the spokespersons for the Syrian opposition, let's say, in Paris. So there's a direct connection there. The DGSE, the French version of the CIA, very big. How many of these people were from them? How many were from other branches of the French military? So there's a confidential negotiation which is being done, I believe, by the French ambassador to Syria, who has been sent back to the country in order to negotiate the departure of these French agents. Now, you can see Syrian government, very clever, don't make a big issue of this. That would play into the hands of the warmonger demagogue Sarkozy as he looks for ways to save himself in this election, which won't be easy to do. So the Syrians are not publicizing this side of it. But that particular fact, I think, has been taken up this past week by Russia Today. Otherwise, let's look at some of the idiocy being circulated here in the U.S. Remember Anne Marie Slaughter? I wrote her up in Obama, the Postmodern Coup, as well as in Barack H. Obama, the Unauthorized Biography. She's in there. This was a woman from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, and she was going to become, and did become, the Policy Planning Bureau of the State Department, Director of Policy at the State Department for a couple of years here in Barkey's first term. And, of course, what could her foreign policy be called? It'd have to be called the Slaughter Plan, of course. So the authoress of the Slaughter Plan, now returned to quackademia for some months or years, recommended this past week the United States and other NATO states should create no-kill zones on Syrian territory where the rebels would be protected. In other words, since the rebels are not capable of maintaining their own enclaves, even peripheral ones, right? There's no Benghazi, no Derna, no Tobruk. The fact that they haven't been able to is not stopping the Slaughter Plan. The Slaughter Plan now says create those enclaves with outside military forces and give them weapons, military training, tactical advice, intelligence, and all the rest. In other words, foment a civil war. Now, this is pretty much what has been done. She's gotten a lot of negative responses to that because her warmonger story, I think, is all too clear. Then we have Stephen Hadley. Here we have the neocons making a comeback on the Syrian issue. Stephen Hadley, as you will remember, was the director of the National Security Council for the last years of Mad Dog Bush Jr. And this Hadley, his recommendation is arms smuggling. He says, no, this is not like Libya. He said, we was wonderful in Libya, he says, because we had all these advantages. Libya only had 6.5 million people. Gaddafi had kept the army weak, he said. Well, another way that he was not a militarist. The major population centers were all accessible along the Mediterranean coast. NATO had superiority, and so forth. So, no invasion, says Hadley, but get those weapons shipped in. We'll be back to this in a minute on World Crisis Radio.